All right, so CPU facts, let's take a look at some of the physical things that we need to deal with. This really does come into, I want to build my own system, as well as just understanding how CPUs are functioning. So by the time we really get done, you're going to take a look at the CPU types and what they are, and then the brands of CPUs out there. And I'm going to extend it beyond what their information is because it's important stuff. So x86 processors, the x86 refers to, now that you understand this, the instruction set. So the x86, that's old school. We're going all the way back in the 80s for that. Now you will also see, and it's not showing it here, x64. So if we go out and look and take a look at x64, that's shorthand for the 64-bit processor architecture. And so if you look at the Wikipedia here, this is what we're at. So you will often see this listed, AMD 64. When you go and download something, they'll often have that listed, AMD 64. AMD 64 and Intel 64, those are obviously AMD's version and Intel's version. But quite often the downloads will just say x86. So if you want a 32-bit for your 32-bit processor, if you've got one of those, what are you going back to, 15 years, something like that? Or whether or not you have x64, which is actually referring to the bits. So this one is referring to the instruction set that was used at the time and what it's compatible with. And this one is, saying this is the bit, the processing power, or the data path. How wide is this? How many can we chunk at one time, right? And honestly, they'll usually say AMD 64, which means it'll work. It'll work. If it'll work on AMD 64, it'll work on Intel 64, and vice versa, unless their website states otherwise. And so that is the architecture. What's in the CPU? The architecture of it. So they're just telling you, hey, most of these CPUs are designed for 64 bits, but the older x86 were 32 bits. And that's what it means when you go out there. It's like, oh, that's 32-bit. That is not the normal that you want. The only time that you would want a 32-bit download is if you're still running Windows XP 32-bit. They actually have it Windows 10, but I'm not sure why anybody would be running that. Best thing to do is download the 64 one, and then if it doesn't work and you get an error saying, hey, this is not for the system, and you got to get the other one. The other things that are out there are ARM processors, and if you're in the 100 class, then you either have gotten there or won't have gotten there yet. But we talk about what those ARM processors are, and the fact that most phones these days are using advanced RISC machines, or ARM processors. They're less power consumption. They're smaller, they generate less heat, and they're used by all these companies. And it's something right in the 100 class or the 170 class that I'm trying to get you to see, that there's this shift happening and Intel's trying to hold on to it. But again, if you really want the truth to be known to yourself, you have to realize that Apple is the only one now that's making desktops with ARM processors in them. Desktops, because Google is making some of their Chromebooks that have these processors in them. However, right, this means they can't do as many types of things as, you need to understand why this is the case. Anytime you try to simplify something so complex down to this small portion, you will miss out totally. The things that are programmed for x86 and x64 are immense, right? That's the desktop systems. x86 around since the 80s. It's got tons and tons of software, tons of things out there for it. So when it says this means they can't do as many types of things, it means they haven't been programmed for these things yet. That's the only thing. That's the only thing that's there. And that's why if you go out and look at Apple's and you look at the M1 processor that is totally ARM-based and the kind of processing power that they're getting out of that, that is the first of a massive wave of all of these people switching and or have switched and building a platform on which software can be built. And you're going to see that moving over within the next 10 years until RISC is really what everybody's using and not Intel stuff. That's why Intel is frantically trying to do things differently now that Apple has released these massively powerful systems. And every once in a while, you'll read a report that'll say, oh, this new Intel processor beats, you know, Apple's. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, it might, maybe a little, but it's using like 4 times the power. What's happened on the Apple stuff is just amazing because they've looked at basically saying, you know what, most people are using notebook, laptop stuff, and they're using tablets. That's what most people are using, and they're plugging in their notebooks into their bigger monitors. They're not using desktop systems. So we're going to make a super powerful RISC processor that will run at a really low or much lower power rate so that you can continue to use that computer for much longer. If you were actually doing the same things and saying this one's running on an Intel chip and this one's running on an M1, which is a RISC processor, this one's going to last hours and hours and hours longer than the other because of how it's designed, because of the power consumption. And that's what has to change on these systems. So overall, you're still, when you say, oh, it can do more, you're really saying I'm compatible with the past. And when you're dealing with ARM processors, you're saying I'm compatible with the future. And hopefully Intel will make that transition over, otherwise they'll be in big trouble. All right, so CPU brands, Intel's out there, obviously AMD, those are the ones, the big x64s, NVIDIA, Qualcomm, Hewlett-Packard, they're usually making ARM architecture processors. So then they get into the AMD and the Intel specifics, which I am not going to get into the specifics of that. You can look at the differences and you'll be just fine with that. All right, so I think that's it for the processors. We'll take a look at input and output.